Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropologists, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest episode of Anthropodimus. We are here with Dr. Paul Shankman of the University of Colorado Boulder, and we're discussing. So this is a little different for us. Usually, me and Les, we talk about a book for our book reviews, but today we have the actual author, Dr. Paul Shankman, who just came out with his latest book, Margaret Mead. So thank you, Dr. Shankman, for coming on today.
Hi, happy to be here.
So I just, I want to point out something to our readers. A lot of the stuff we discuss in a lot of the publications that we review, they're not easily accessible, and the writing is geared more towards those who are in the field of anthropology, right? I mean, a lot of these publications you can't even get unless you're a university student or have a subscription that you're paying for. But this book, it's written really towards anybody who's interested in Margaret Mead and easily accessible on Amazon. So I highly encourage everyone to pick up a copy because Margaret Mead was really a fascinating woman. But before we get started on the book, Dr. Shankman, can you tell us, I mean, you really built a career on her work and studying her. Can you tell us, how was it that you became so interested in her?
Well, I did field work in Samoa, and of course, Margaret Mead's first book was Coming of Age in Samoa, so her shadow was cast among all of those who worked in those islands. But I first met Margaret Mead as an undergraduate in the mid-1960s when she came to University of California at Santa Barbara for a one-week visit. And she was visiting the Department of Anthropology and needed a chauffeur. So I volunteered my 1953 Studebaker Champion V8 with Whitewall tires to be her chariot. And so I got to know her over the week as an undergraduate, asking ridiculous questions about anthropology and anthropologists. And then when I did my field work for my dissertation in 1969, 1970, I met with her at the American Museum of Natural History to talk a little bit about Samoa and what kinds of work I was doing that she thought should be done. And then I would occasionally meet her after that. My future wife worked at the American Museum of Natural History and was an editor for Margaret Mead, so I talked to her. But I really got interested in Margaret Mead after the controversy over her Samoan work broke in 1983 when Derek Freeman published a book criticizing Margaret Mead's work on Samoa. And since 1983, I've become more and more deeply involved with her.
And I wasn't really going to get into the Freeman thing until later on, but since you brought him up already, I mean, I found it very interesting that his perception on that culture was so different, but it's almost like he just completely ignored that, the time difference and the Western influence and the fact that, women especially are going to interact with him differently since he's a man than they would have a young female.
Well, those are all good points, but it goes deeper than that. I mean, Derek Freeman also was one of those who found himself in the shadow of Margaret Mead. And to Freeman, Margaret Mead represented a number of things that he personally had problems with, including women scholars, the subject of sex. So Freeman came to criticize Margaret Mead not only as an academic, and a very different kind of academic than Margaret Mead, but as an individual, as a person who had deep issues with the kind of person that Margaret Mead was.
So I want to piggyback on that. How did you perceive her differently after actually doing all of this research and writing this book?
Well, the thing that I took away from writing this particular book, as well as my earlier book on the trashing of Margaret Mead, which is about the controversy, was that she was such a complex person that people could almost read into her anything they wanted to. I mean, she was independent, she was unconventional, she was paradoxical, she was controversial. Conservatives disliked Margaret Mead because they felt that she was too liberal. Liberals were sometimes embarrassed by Margaret Mead because she was occasionally conservative. And again, it depended to some extent on the period of her life in which she was writing. So in the 1920s, 1930s, she was writing about the importance of culture and cultural variability, because race and biology were thought to determine human behavior. And she wanted to present a cultural perspective. But later, after World War II, in the late 1940s, 1950s, she said, yes, cultural variability is important, but you cannot completely ignore the fact that human beings are biological creatures, and that there are biological processes that are universal that limit what humans can do in terms of cultural variability. I can give you an example. Mead talked about this in her best-selling book, Male and Female, which was published in 1949. And she said, I've studied 7 different cultures. Here are the lessons that we've learned about cultural variability. But if you look at women, for example, women menstruate. Women are part of the process of conception. They give birth. They lactate. These are universals that are rooted in human biology. Now, what humans do with those biological processes is highly variable, but not limitless in terms of infinite variability.
And I think that's very understandable considering how long she was in the field for, and with the advances in science that are constantly going on, your perspectives on things are going to change. Going to, you portrayed a very different Margaret Mead in the beginning of the book compared to the end, where she appears in some ways to become more conservative. But even so, I feel like a lot of us still see her as a feminist for her time, but she herself did not. Why is it that you think that she did not refer to herself as a feminist?
That's a great question. What I can tell you is that if you look at her Red Book columns that she wrote from the 1960s into the 1970s until her death in 1978, you get a Margaret Mead writing for the public, and she's conforming to public norms rather than pushing the envelope. So, for example, in the late 1920s, in Coming of Age in Samoa, Mead seems to be very accepting of premarital sex, a certain amount of freedom for adolescents. But in her Red Book columns, which were read by millions of young women, she comes out against premarital sex. She's very much for the institution of marriage. And she gets a lot of backlash from real feminists because in this period in her life, she is very mainstream. She's in tune with what the majority of American women are thinking at the time. So, again, Margaret Mead, a very, very complex figure. And to address your question directly, I'm not really certain why she moved in this direction. I think as a senior public figure, she became a lot more cautious than she was when she was in her 20s and 30s.
And sometimes, and reading this, I wonder if her views changed because she's dedicated so much of her life to this career. And I wonder if she felt guilt for not being around as much for her daughter. Because I know myself, I don't work nearly as much as probably Margaret Mead did, but I still have that guilt of trying to balance, being a mother and a wife and a student and, building my career. So I wonder if that had anything to do with it.
Okay, great question. So Margaret Mead is in her late 30s, in the late 1930s, and she's had a number of miscarriages. Doctors told her that because she had a tipped uterus, she wouldn't be able to carry a pregnancy to term. But in 1939, miraculously, she's able to give birth to her daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, or Kathy. But just before she gives birth, World War II in Europe begins, and Margaret Mead, as an important researcher, anthropologist, public figure, wants to be part of the war effort. So she's constantly moving between New York and Washington, D.C., traveling to England to do work on the war there. And she's really not there as much as she wants to be for her daughter, who's being raised in a more or less communal household by wonderful people. I think Margaret Mead did have some regrets about not being there for her daughter, but she also felt that because there was this very supportive extended family, that Kathy got a very good upbringing, a great childhood.
And before I keep continuing, Les, what other questions do you have?
Oh no, if you want to continue, that's okay. I was going to say, or I was going to ask, if you had one thing that you would say, if you could advertise this book to readers around, all of our listeners, rather, if you could advertise your book to all of our listeners with one sentence, what would you say about it?
Wow. If you're curious about Margaret Mead, this is a good way to expand your knowledge of her.
I will say that is it's a very true answer. She's a fascinating woman, and this is chocked full of information about her.
Yeah, she is just so interesting. I mean, this book was fun to write. It was a pleasure to write. It was because Margaret Mead just had so many different facets to her life. I mean, in the book, we're not just talking about her professional life. We're also talking about her personal life because they were intimately intertwined. So, for example, when she gives birth to Kathy, she's no longer an anthropologist studying mothers and children. Now she's actually a mother with a child. And this gives her a different perspective on this subject that she's already devoted a good chunk of her life to.
So what part of the book did you enjoy writing the most?
Oh, I think I enjoyed it all. I mean, there's just so many different parts to her life. For example, I had written considerably about her work in Samoa, the earliest part of her career. but her work in Bali is often not well known, and it wasn't well known to me either. In the late 1930s, she spent over 2 years in Bali with her third husband, Gregory Bateson. And this was a different kind of field work because she had worked in a number of South Pacific cultures, which were small and less complex, often numbering hundreds or just thousands of people in a particular population. Well, in Bali, you have over 1 million Balinese speakers. It's Southeast Asian culture. It's highly stratified with castes. It's complex. It's rich with art and music, architecture, incredible agricultural features. And this part of her life was something that I really didn't know much about, so it was fascinating to me.
Yeah, I actually hadn't heard about her work in Bali before I read this. So that was something that I found particularly interesting.
Yeah. One of the things that Margaret Mead was criticized for in the 1920s and 30s was that she wasn't spending enough time in the field. I mean, she would spend 8 months in American Samoa. She would spend 3 months on the Omaha Reservation in 1930. She would spend 6 months here, 7 months there, 3 months here. I mean, she did an enormous amount of field work in a number of different cultures in a very short period of time, but she was criticized for not spending an extensive period of time, essentially accused of doing drive-by anthropology. But in Bali, she's there for over 2 years. I mean, really immersing herself in the culture for a long period of time. The drive-by criticism just doesn't hold.
So I wanted to make sure I read this right. Her and Benedict, I read this right? Her and Benedict created a grant to get rid of Fortune. They created a grant to send him overseas and get rid of him.
Okay, so Rio Fortune is Mead's second husband.
Right.
And she does field work with him on Manus off the coast of New Guinea, on the Omaha Reservation in the summer of 1930, and then in 3 different New Guinea cultures in the early 1930s. And initially, this is a really good relationship. They work well together in the field. But in the CPIC, all of this kind of falls apart. And one of the reasons is that Mead is falling in love with another anthropologist working in the same area, Gregory Bateson. And this leads to a very tense and awkward situation. Bateson and Mead, who are falling in love with each other, worry that this love triangle is going to lead to violence. It ultimately leads to the dissolution of the field work by all of them. They go back to Australia, and then Mead returns to New York alone. And it's not just the dissolution of a marriage, a personal relationship, it's also the dissolution of a professional relationship. So Mead and Fortune, who had been on the same page intellectually, are now adversaries. So they're personal adversaries, they're intellectual adversaries, and Mead and Benedict decide we need to keep Rio Fortune at arm's length, and they do devise a plan to fund research that will keep him at arm's length from Margaret Mead for some time, and indeed they don't see each other for the next 20 years.
Wow.
That's a really long arm's length,
It's interesting because Mead writes that the Arapesh that they'd studied together had no warfare. And Fortune, a few years later, without any reference to Mead whatsoever, publishes an article on Arapesh warfare in the American Anthropologist. And it's a very deft criticism of Mead without ever mentioning her by name. So this was not a good relationship. She went on to marry Bateson, and ultimately, in their old age, they reconciled, Fortune, Bateson, and Margaret Mead.
Clearly, there was a lot of passion in that relationship for him to have been so invested even after their parting. I mean, you don't hate somebody to a point where it affects you for so long without caring about that person. So what I'm thinking here is that Margaret Mead, being who she is, must have been a really wonderful person to be around for him to be that invested.
Well, Margaret Mead was in love with the idea of love.
We all know one of those people.
Was engaged in passionate relationships, and including her 3 husbands, but also including a number of other men and women.
Okay.
Right. I feel like we all have that person in our life who we know is always in love.
The true romantic.
Yeah.
This episode that occurred with the love triangle between Fortune, Bateson, and Mead was the subject of a recent novel by Lily King. It was a best-selling novel called Euphoria. It's also featured in Charles King's Gods of the Upper Air. I mean, this is a piece of anthropological lore that people love to learn about because it is so passionate, and it shows that anthropologists are human beings first and foremost, not just scholars who try and be objective.
I mean, you try to be objective, but like you mentioned before, even Margaret Mead could say that there are limits to that. We are humans, we're biological creatures, right?
Oh, yes. But Mead in the 1930s was also talking about this whole problem of subjectivity that a lot of cultural anthropologists became involved with much later. She recognized that, yes, there is this human element in fieldwork. There is this personal equation in writing up your material. It's not just black and white.
Yeah, all of your experiences, your learning, your family, everything, all of your culture affects how you view other cultures. So any research that you do in general is going to be tinted through that, we'll say rose-colored glass, if you want.
Right. But there's a danger here, and that is that the anthropologist may become more interesting than the people he or she or they study. And that, I think, is sometimes the case with Margaret Mead. I mean, again, she is just so complex. She's so interesting. There's so many different pieces to her life that people read about Samoa, and then they read about Margaret Mead and say, geez, who is more interesting?
Do you feel like part of the reason she was criticized so much, though, was because she was a woman in still a fairly male-dominated field?
Yes. I don't think there's any question about that. And the topics she chose for example, adolescence in coming of age in Samoa, childhood in growing up in New Guinea. I mean, in book reviews, male anthropologists actually questioned whether these were real anthropological subjects or whether this was kind of women's anthropology or whether it was even anthropology at all. So you get people like Alfred Kroeber, who was at the University of California, Berkeley, a dean of American anthropology at that time, writing that, growing up in New Guinea wasn't really a very good book, that it was substandard, that Malinowski's work in the Trobriands and his theoretical work was much, much better. And, these people like Kroeber are gatekeepers of professional reputations. They tell you where you rank in the discipline. So a negative review by a major figure, a male figure, really let Margaret Mead know that her work was not really considered up to the standard of most male anthropologists. Indeed, Kroeber and other reviewers actually said, "We're waiting for the work of Rio Fortune, her husband, on the same culture, because we expect that to be much better, higher caliber, much more complete."
And sometimes I feel like because she was a woman and she attracted so much attention, if that was a little bit of jealousy on their part also.
That could be, but if you look at her relationship with Edward Sapir, for example, Edward Sapir was a brilliant linguist. He was a student of Franz Boas, like Margaret Mead, and they had an affair before she went to American Samoa in the mid-1920s. And Mead decides that she needs to end this affair. I mean, she's still married to Luther Cressman, and she ends it, and it ends badly for Edward Sapir, who is an important figure in anthropology. And he gives her both negative reviews in public and also spreads the word that her work is really substandard. So it's not just a matter of, me being a woman. This is a personal relationship gone bad, and Edward Sapir is going to make Margaret Mead pay for it.
It seems like the fact that she's mixing her personal life with her careers, I mean, obviously it's causing her issues, but do you think that maybe that also increased her publicity and made her more of a topic?
Margaret Mead's personal life was known to a circle of people within anthropology, but it was not well known outside of anthropology. I mean, yes, she had 3 husbands. This was very unusual. She did get divorces in Mexico because such divorces were more discreet and much easier to get than in America at that time. But, for example, her personal relationship, her intimate relationship with Ruth Benedict, which was really important for her, both personally and intellectually, that was unknown until well after her death. And it happened right around the time of the Mead-Freeman controversy, when Derek Freeman was actually going to out Margaret Mead as a lesbian or bisexual. And her daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, wrote a book With a Daughter's Eye, where she wanted to beat Derek Freeman to the punch, so to speak. I mean, Derek Freeman was going to reveal this chapter in Margaret Mead's life in a salacious rumor kind of way. And Catherine Bateson actually said, look, yes, this is a chapter in my mother's life. I didn't know about it. Many other people didn't know about it, but it was part of her life, and it should be part of her biography.
And I think I mean, to me, I find it important that that's within her biography, because it does show how progressive she was. I mean, I feel like it fits in with her perspective on love, open love, and how modern she was.
Well, this is a result of Margaret Mead moving from DePauw University in Indiana to Barnard College in New York City, which is affiliated with Columbia. And New York City opened all of these new vistas for very young Margaret Mead. And, she was just in her late teens, early 20s. And there was this movement, a free love movement, which said, love is paramount. If it coincides with marriage, that's great, but love is really important. Multiple partners are possible. Homosexual relationships are a possibility. All of these things were really revolutionary in the 1920s, and only a very tiny fraction of Americans embraced them. But Margaret Mead was one of them, and the ideology of free love did influence her early work to some extent.
Something I wanted to ask, I wanted to backtrack to one of my previous questions. Did Fortune ever find out that they created this grant to get rid of him?
And Lisa Dobrin and Ira Bashko have written about this particular chapter in Mead's life. And I don't think I remember or know the answer to that question. But Fortune did move on. He was almost an itinerant anthropologist, moving from culture to culture, position to position. Some anthropologists and sociologists thought that he was, quote, mad as a hatter. This was the impression of sociologist George Homans, who knew Rio Fortune. But if you actually look at the body of Fortune's work, he was a really good anthropologist whose work has really been neglected. I mean, he's really thought of more as the second husband of Margaret Mead than an important ethnographer in his own right. And I think that would be a mistake.
Yeah, I was going to say he seems to have a very similar not career trajectory. He just seems to be at least as energetic as Margaret Mead.
Oh, yes. I mean, he came from a poor rural background, and he's catapulted into, elite anthropological society in London, where he begins his graduate work. And he's not the same kind of person as, many of the professors and graduate students that he encounters, but he's a very capable field worker. And if you look at his work, including his work with Margaret Mead, it's really quite good.
All right. I think those are all my questions.
Yeah, I'm pretty much I'm out of questions as well.
Yeah. I did want to say though, I didn't really know anything about Margaret Mead before reading this. I think we had like an hour lecture in Intro to Cultural Anthropology, when I was a freshman many, many years ago. So, I mean, I do, for those who are interested in Margaret Mead or who are taking the Intro to Cultural Anthropology and have a paper to write, I mean, I think this is a great book to pick up. Um, everything you need to know about her is in here, and it's a short, easy read. It's even big font, so you make it feel like you're reading it even faster. um, so I do. You want an introduction to Margaret Mead? Highly recommend it. Matter of fact, you can write a paper on her and base it mostly on this book, and then just take some of the works cited from the reference page.
Yeah, well, it's very well cited. You could easily find supporting pieces just by looking at the other works.
Yeah. So, thank you again, Dr. Paul Shankman, for coming on the show with us. We greatly appreciate it. We enjoyed the book. For our listeners, you can get this on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle, paperback, hardcover. Yes, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's not too expensive either. I had to buy 2 copies of this because somebody else I was saw me reading it at work. Another person who was studying anthropology and was very interested, so I ordered another copy for that person.
Oh, great.
Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.